Chapter 2. Sheriff Cowan was at the lodge when we arrived. Old Peter was with him. The sheriff was a tall, saturnine individual, clearly of Yankee stock. Though representing the fourth generation of his family in the area, he spoke with a twang which doubtless had persisted from generation to generation. The half-breed was a dark-skinned, ill-kempt fellow. He had a way of saying little, and from time to time grinned or snickered as at some secret joke. "I brung up express that come some time past for the professor," said the sheriff. "From some place in Massachusetts was one of 'em, and the other from down near Madison. Didn't seem to me 'twas worth sending back, so I took and brung 'em with the keys. Don't know that you fellers'll get anywheres. My posse and me went through the Hull woods. Didn't see a thing." "You ain't telling 'em everything," put in the half-breed, grinning. "Ain't no more to tell." "What about the carvin'?" The sheriff shrugged irritably. "Damn it, Peter, that ain't got nothing to do with the professor's disappearance." "He made a drawing of it, didn't he?" So pressed, the sheriff confided that two members of his posse had stumbled upon a great slab of rock in the center of the wood. It was mossy and overgrown, but there was upon it an odd drawing, plainly as old as the forest, probably the work of one of the primitive Indian tribes, once known to inhabit northern Wisconsin before the Dakota Sioux and the Winnebago. Old Peter grunted with contempt. "No Indian drawing." The sheriff shook this off and went on. The drawing represented some kind of creature, but no one could tell what it was. It was certainly not a man, but on the other hand, it did not seem to be hairy like a beast. Moreover, the unknown artist had forgotten to put in a face. "And beside it there was two things," said the half-breed. "Don't pay no attention to him," said the sheriff then. "What two things?" demanded Laird. "Just things," replied the half-breed, snickering. "Ain't no other way to tell it. Weren't human, weren't animal, just things." Cowan was irritated. He became suddenly brusque. He ordered the half-breed to keep still, and went on to say that if we needed him, he would be at his office in Pashapaho. He did not explain how we were to make contact with him, since there was no telephone at the lodge, but plainly he had no high regard for the legends abounding about the area into which we had ventured with such determination. The half-breed regarded us with an almost stolid indifference, broken only by his sly grin from time to time, and his dark eyes examined our luggage with keen speculation and interest. Laird met his gaze occasionally, and each time old Peter indolently shifted his eyes. The sheriff went on talking. The notes and drawings the missing man had made were on the desk he had used in the big room which made up almost the entire ground floor of the lodge, just where he had found them. They were the property of the state of Wisconsin, and were to be returned to the sheriff's office when we had finished with them. At the threshold he turned for a parting shot to say he hoped we would not be staying too long, because, while I ain't given in to any of them crazy ideas, it just ain't been so healthy for some of the people who came here. "The half-breed knows or suspects something," said Laird at once. "We'll have to get in touch with him sometime when the sheriff's not around." "Didn't Gardner write that he was pretty closed-mouthed when it came to concrete data?" "Yes, but he indicated the way out. Firewater." We went to work and settled ourselves, storing our food supplies, setting up the dictaphone, getting things into readiness for a stay of at least a fortnight. Our supplies were sufficient for this length of time, and if we had to remain longer, we could always go into Pashapaho for more food. Moreover, Laird had brought fully 24 dictaphone cylinders, so that we had plenty of them for an indefinite time, particularly since we did not intend to use them except when we slept. And this would not be often, for we had agreed that one of us would watch while the other took his rest, an arrangement we were not sanguine enough to believe would hold good without fail, hence the machine. It was not until after we had settled our belongings that we turned to the things the sheriff had brought, and meanwhile we had an ample opportunity to become aware of the very definite aura of the place. For it was not imagination that there was a strange aura about the lodge and the grounds. It was not alone the brooding, almost sinister stillness, nor alone the tall pines encroaching upon the lodge, nor alone the blue-black waters of the lake, but something more than that. A hushed, almost menacing air of waiting, a kind of aloof assurance that was ominous. As one might imagine a hawk might feel, leisurely cruising above prey it knows will not escape its talons. Nor was this a fleeting impression, for it was obvious almost at once, and it grew with sure steadiness throughout the hour or so that we worked there. Moreover, it was so plainly to be felt that Laird commented upon it as if he had long ago accepted it, and I knew that I too had done so. Yet there was nothing primary to which this could be attributed. There are thousands of lakes like Rick's in northern Wisconsin and Minnesota, and while many of them are not in forest areas, those which are do not differ greatly in their physical aspects from Rick's, so there was nothing in the appearance of the place which at all contributed to the brooding sense of horror which seemed to invade us from outside. Indeed, the setting was rather the opposite. Under the afternoon sunlight, the old lodge, the lake, the high forest all around, had a pleasant air of seclusion, an air which made the contrast with the intangible aura of evil all the more pointed and fearsome. The fragrance of the pines, together with the freshness of the water, served also to emphasize the intangible mood of menace. We turned at last to the material left on Professor Gardiner's desk. The express packages contained, as expected, a copy of The Outsider and Others by H.P. Lovecraft, shipped by the publishers, and photostatic copies of manuscript and printed pages taken from the Relier text and Ludwig Prin's De Vermis Mysteris, apparently sent for to supplement the earlier data dispatched to the professor by the librarian of Miskatonic University, for we found among the material brought back by the sheriff certain pages from the Necronomicon in the translation by Olaus Vormius, and likewise from the Pnakotic manuscripts. But it was not these pages, which for the most part were unintelligible to us, which held our attention. It was the fragmentary notes left by Professor Gardiner. It was quite evident that he had not had time to do more than put down such questions and thoughts as had occurred to him, and while there was little assimilation manifest, yet there was about what he had written a certain terrible suggestiveness which grew to colossal proportions as everything he had not put down became obvious. Is the slab A only an ancient ruin, B a marker similar to a tomb, C or a focal point for him? If the latter, from outside or from beneath, nota bene, nothing to show that the thing has been disturbed. Cthulhu or Cthulhut in Rick's Lake, subterranean passage to Superior and the sea via the St. Lawrence, nota bene, except for the aviator's story, nothing to show that the thing has anything to do with the water, probably not one of the water beings. Hastur, but manifestations do not seem to have been of air beings either. Yog-Sothoth, of earth certainly, but he is not the dweller in darkness. Nota bene, the thing, whatever it is, must be of the earth deities, even though it travels in time and space. It could possibly be more than one, of which only the earth being is occasionally visible. Ithaquah, perhaps. Dweller in darkness. Could he be the same as the blind, faceless one? He could be truly said to be dwelling in darkness. Nyarlathotep, or Shub-Niggurath. What a fire! There must be a deity here too, but no mention. Nota bene, presumably, if the earth and water beings oppose those of air, then they must oppose those of fire as well. Yet there is evidence here and there to show that there is more constant struggle between air and water beings than between those of earth and air. Abdul al-Hazred is damnably obscure in places. There is no clue as to the identity of Cthulhu in that terrible footnote. Partier says I am on the wrong track. I am not convinced. Whoever it is that plays the music in the night is a master of hellish cadence and rhythm, and yes, of cacophony. Confer Bierce and Chambers. That was all. What incredible gibberish! I exclaimed. And yet, I knew instinctively it was not gibberish. Strange things had happened here, things which demanded an explanation which was not terrestrial. And here, in Gardiner's handwriting, was evidence to show that he had not only arrived at the same conclusion, but passed it. However it might sound, Gardiner had written it in all seriousness, and clearly for his own use alone, since only the vaguest and most suggestive outline seemed apparent. Moreover, the notes had a startling effect on Laird. He had gone quite pale, and now stood looking down as if he could not believe what he had seen. "What is it?" I asked.
"Jack, he was in contact with Partier."
"It doesn't register," I answered, but even as I spoke, I remembered the hush-hush that had attended the severing of old Professor Partier's connection with the University of Wisconsin. It had been given out to the press that the old man had been somewhat too liberal in his lectures in anthropology, that is, he had communistic leanings, which everyone who knew Partier realized was far from the facts. But he had said strange things in his lectures, he had talked of horrible, forbidden matters, and it had been thought best to let him out quietly. Unfortunately, Partier went out trumpeting in his contemptuous manner, and it had been difficult to hush the matter up satisfactorily.
"He's living down in Wausau now," said Laird.
"Do you suppose he could translate all this?" I asked, and knew that I had echoed the thought in Laird's mind.
"He's 3 hours away by car. We'll copy these notes, and if nothing happens, if we can't discover anything, we'll go to see him."
If nothing happened! If the lodge by day had seemed brooding in an air of ominousness, by night it seemed surcharged with menace. Moreover, events began to take place with disarming and insidious suddenness, beginning in mid-evening, when Laird and I were sitting over those curious photostats sent out by Miskatonic University in lieu of the books and manuscripts themselves, which were far too valuable to permit out of their haven. The first manifestation was so simple that for some time neither of us noticed its strangeness. It was simply the sound in the trees, as of rising wind, the growing song among the pines. The night was warm, and all the windows of the lodge stood open. Laird commented on the wind, and went on giving voice to his perplexity regarding the fragments before us. Not until half an hour had gone by, and the sound of the wind had risen to the proportions of a gale, did it occur to Laird that something was wrong, and he looked up, his eyes going from one open window to another in growing apprehension. Then I, too, became aware. Despite the tumult of the wind, no draught of air had circulated in the room, not one of the light curtains at the window was so much as trembling. With one simultaneous movement, both of us stepped out upon the broad veranda of the lodge. There was no wind, no breath of air stirring to touch our hands and faces. There was only the sound in the forest. And both of us looked up to where the pines were silhouetted against the star-swept heavens, expecting their tops would be bending before a high gale. But there was no movement whatever. The pines stood still, motionless, and the sound as of wind continued all around us. We stood on the veranda for half an hour, vainly attempting to determine the source of the sound, and then, as unobtrusively as it had begun, it stopped. The hour was now approaching midnight, and Laird prepared for bed. He had slept little the previous night, and we had agreed that I was to take the first watch until 4 in the morning. Neither of us said much about the sound in the pines, but what was said indicated a desire to believe that there was a natural explanation for the phenomenon if we could establish a point of contact for understanding. It was inevitable, I suppose, that even in the face of all the curious facts which had come to our attention, there should still be an earnest wish to find a natural explanation. Certainly, the oldest fear and the greatest fear to which man is prey is fear of the unknown. Anything capable of rationalization and explanation cannot be feared, but it was growing hourly more patent that we were facing something which defied all known rationales and credos, but hinged upon a system of belief that antedated even primitive man, and indeed, as scattered hints within the photostat pages from Miskatonic University suggested, antedated even Earth itself. And there was always that brooding terror, the ominous suggestion of menace from something far beyond the grasp of such puny intelligence as man's. Thus it was with some trepidation that I prepared for my vigil. After Laird had gone to his room, which was at the head of the stairs, with a door opening upon a railed-in balcony looking down into the lodge-room where I sat with the book by Lovecraft, reading here and there in its pages, I settled down to a kind of apprehensive waiting. It was not that I was afraid of what might take place, but rather that I was afraid that what took place might be beyond my understanding. However, as the minutes ticked past, I became engrossed in The Outsider and Others, with its hellish suggestions of eon-old evil, of entities coexistent with all time and conterminous with all space, and began to understand, however vaguely, a relation between the writing of this fantasist and the curious notes Professor Gardiner had made. The most disturbing factor in this cognizance was the knowledge that Professor Gardiner had made his notes independent of the book I now read, since it had arrived after his disappearance. Moreover, though there were certain keys to what Gardiner had written in the first material he had received from Miskatonic University, there was growing now a mass of evidence to indicate that the professor had had access to some other source of information. What was that source? Could he have learned something from old Peter? Hardly likely. Could he have gone to Partières? It was not impossible that he had done so, though he had not imparted this information to Laird. Yet it was not to be ruled out that he had made contact with still another source, of which there was no hint among his notes. It was while I was engaged in this engrossing speculation that I became conscious of the music. It may actually have been sounding for some time before I heard it, but I do not think so. It was a curious melody that was being played, beginning as something lulling and harmonious, and then suddenly becoming cacophonous and demoniac, rising in tempo, though all the time coming as from a great distance. I listened to it with growing astonishment. I was not at first aware of the sense of evil which fell upon me the moment I stepped outside and became cognizant that the music emanated from the depths of the dark forest. There, too, I was sharply conscious of its weirdness. The melody was unearthly, utterly bizarre and foreign, and the instruments which were being used seemed to be flutes, or certainly some variation of flutes. Up to that moment, there was no really alarming manifestation. That is, there was nothing but the suggestiveness of the two events which had taken place to inspire fear. There was, in short, always a good possibility that there might be a natural explanation about the sound as of wind and that of music. But now, suddenly, there occurred something so utterly horrible, something so fraught with terror, that I was at once made prey to the most terrible fear known to man, a surging primitive horror of the unknown, of something from outside. For if I had had doubts about the things suggested by Gardiner's notes and the material accompanying them, I knew instinctively that they were unfounded, but the sound that succeeded the strains of that unearthly music was of such a nature that it defied description, and defies it even now. It was simply a ghastly ululation made by no beast known to man, and certainly by no man. It rose to an awful crescendo, and fell away into a silence that was all the more terrible for this soul-searing crying. It began with a two-note call, twice repeated, a frightful sound. Ignaya! Ignaya! and then became a triumphant wailing cry that ululated out of the forest and into the dark night like the hideous voice of the pit itself.
Ah, ya, 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 ha, 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 ah, ha, ha, naga, naga, ya, ya, ya.
I stood for a minute, absolutely frozen to the veranda. I could not have uttered a sound if it had been necessary to save my life. The voice had ceased, but the trees still seemed to echo its frightful syllables. I heard Laird tumble from his bed. I heard him running down the stairs, calling my name, but I could not answer. He came out on the veranda and caught hold of my arm.
Good God, what was that?
Did you hear it?
I heard enough.
We stood waiting for it to sound again, but there was no repetition of it, nor was there a repetition of the music. We returned to the sitting room and waited there, neither of us able to sleep. But there was not another manifestation of any kind throughout the remainder of that night.